Hello. Welcome back to Dark Files Now, the channel where real mysteries, unsolved crimes, and the darkest chapters of history come to life. If you're fascinated by true stories that continue to puzzle investigators decades later, you're in the right place. Today, we journey into one of the most daring and mysterious crimes ever committed, a case that has captivated the world for more than 50 years. So sit back, dim the lights, and join me as we examine the facts, the evidence, and the unanswered questions behind this fascinating true story. This is the case of D.B. Cooper, the day someone disappeared into thin air. On November 24, 1971, a man boarded a domestic flight in the United States with a suitcase, a ticket purchased with cash, and a plan no one had ever tried before. When the plane landed in Seattle, he was no longer on board. He had parachuted into one of the most hostile and remote regions of the American Northwest, taking $200,000 in ransom with him. He was never captured. He was never definitively identified, and the money, with very rare exceptions, was never found. The case became known by the codename the man used to buy the ticket, D.B. Cooper. And it remains, to this day, the only unsolved case of air piracy in the history of American aviation. Who was D.B. Cooper? A war veteran, a former paratrooper, a professional criminal with a meticulous plan, or an ordinary man who simply had an extraordinarily audacious idea and was never seen again? This question has echoed for over 50 years. This is the story of the man who outsmarted the system, defied aviation, stole a mid-flight ransom, and disappeared into the darkness of a November night, leaving behind only mystery, legend, and one of the FBI's longest and most frustrating investigations. D.B. Cooper, the ghost who jumped from a plane and never landed again. The hijacking, aboard Flight 305. On the afternoon of November 24, 1971, the eve of Thanksgiving, Portland International Airport in Oregon was operating normally. Passengers were boarding Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305, bound for Seattle. It was a short flight, just under an hour. 36 passengers, 2 pilots, and 2 flight attendants. Among the passengers was a man who had bought his ticket with cash, using the name Dan Cooper. He wore a dark suit, a black wool tie, sunglasses, and carried a briefcase. A completely ordinary appearance, nothing that would attract attention. He sat in seat 18A, in the last row on the right side near the rear exit. Shortly after takeoff, the man caught the attention of flight attendant Florence Schaffner and handed her a folded note. Florence, accustomed to receiving messages from passengers, put the note in her bag without reading it. The man leaned over and said in a low voice, "Miss, you'd better read that note. I have a bomb." The note demanded $20,000 in used bills, later negotiated down to $200,000 for parachutes and an escape vehicle. The man discreetly opened the briefcase and showed the flight attendant what was inside: wires, red cylinders, and a detonator. Whether real or not, the threat was convincing enough. The flight attendant went to the cockpit to inform the pilots. Captain William Scott activated the emergency protocol and reported the hijacking to the authorities. The FBI was immediately notified. A decision was made to comply with the hijackers' demands to ensure the safety of the passengers. The plane entered an orbit over Seattle while the rescue was being prepared. Authorities gathered $200,000 in $20 bills whose serial numbers were carefully photographed. 2 military and 2 civilian parachutes were provided. When the plane landed in Seattle for refueling, the crew handed over the money and parachutes as requested. All passengers were released. Only the crew remained on board. With the hostages safe, Cooper ordered the plane to take off toward Mexico, but with specific restrictions: a maximum altitude of 3,000 meters, reduced speed, flaps in landing position, and landing gear down. Conditions that clearly were not for a layman. Cooper knew exactly what he was asking for. The Boeing 727 was the only commercial aircraft of the time equipped with a rear staircase, the famous Cooper vane, that could be opened in mid-flight without decompressing the cabin. Cooper knew this. Between 8:11 p.m. and 8:15 p.m. on November 24, 1971, over southwestern Washington state, D.B. Cooper opened the rear stairs, strapped the money to his body, and jumped into the void. The jump, disappearance in the dark. It was a November night in the American Northwest. Outside temperature of approximately -14 degrees Celsius. Considerable wind speed. Rain and possible snow. The terrain below, dense, dark forest, with no visible lighting. These were conditions that would make any experienced skydiver hesitate. Cooper did not hesitate. The crew felt the drop in pressure and the change in the plane's dynamics when the rear stairs were opened. At 8:13 p.m., the pressure system registered that someone had exited. When FBI agents, who were monitoring the flight in military aircraft nearby, tried to locate the jump point, they found only darkness and forest. No sign of life. No beacon. No trace. Military and civilian experts who analyzed the conditions of the jump were unanimous. The chances of survival were low. Without night vision equipment, without precise knowledge of the terrain, with sub-zero temperatures, carrying money strapped to his body, and wearing inadequate clothing for a night jump in extreme conditions. But the absence of a body could never be explained either. The estimated drop zone was between the Lewis and Columbia rivers, on the border of Washington and Oregon states, a region of forest so dense that it was practically impossible to cross without proper equipment. The FBI mapped the area and began ground and air searches in the following days. They found absolutely nothing. The searches lasted days, then weeks. Helicopters flew over the region. Specialized search and rescue teams penetrated the forest. Sniffer dogs were used. Nothing. There was no trace of Cooper, the parachute, the money, or any equipment. It was as if the forest had simply absorbed him. The only certainty the investigators had was that D.B. Cooper had jumped with $200,000, and whether alive or dead, he was somewhere in that forest. What happened after the jump remains, to this day, absolutely unknown. The Investigation, the FBI in the field. The FBI immediately opened what would become one of the longest and most costly cases in its history. The operation was codenamed Norjack for Northwest Airlines hijacking. Hundreds of agents were mobilized. The investigation lasted 45 years before being formally closed in July 2016, although the case remains technically unsolved. Based on crew testimonies, the FBI produced 2 composite sketches of the suspect. The consistent description: white male, between 40 and 50 years old, approximately 1 meter and 80 centimeters tall, weighing between 70 and 80 kilograms, dark hair, brown skin. Common appearance, calm posture, polite voice. No one on the crew could identify signs of nervousness. The serial numbers of the 200,000 bills were published and widely disseminated. Banks, casinos, and commercial establishments across the country were alerted to check the bills. For years, no bills appeared in circulation. Whoever had the money wasn't spending it. This suggested either that Cooper was dead, or that he was extraordinarily patient and careful. One of the few physical pieces of evidence left by Cooper was his tie, a thin, black, clip-on wool tie, left on his seat when the suspect changed equipment. Decades later, DNA analysis extracted genetic material from the tie. The problem: the profile didn't match any suspect in the database, and questions about possible contamination were never fully resolved. Over the 45 years that the case remained officially active, the FBI investigated more than 1,000 suspects. All were ruled out, some for solid alibis, others for incompatible physical analysis, still others for lack of any evidence connecting them to the crime. Cooper's profile remained the same and didn't match anyone specific. A point of enormous controversy in the investigation was the exact determination of the jump zone. The FBI calculated that Cooper jumped between the Lewis and Columbia rivers. Independent researchers, using pressure and flight speed data, argued that the jump point could be tens of kilometers to the north, in a completely different region, even less accessible and not yet systematically searched. In July 2016, the FBI announced the closure of the active investigation into the Norjack case. The official statement said that resources would be redirected to more urgent threats, but it added that any new concrete evidence would be analyzed. It was a veiled admission of the obvious. After 45 years, the FBI had come no closer to identifying D.B. Cooper than it had in November 1971. The humano, the only physical evidence. In February 1980, 8 years after the kidnapping, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was digging a bonfire on the banks of the Columbia River, near Vancouver, Washington State. His shovel touched something. He pulled out 3 bundles of $20 bills, partially decomposed by moisture and time. The serial numbers confirmed what seemed impossible. It was D.B. Cooper's money. The 3 bundles contained 294 bills, a total of $5,880 of the original $200,000. They were decomposed, stained, and partially disintegrated, but the serial numbers were legible. The question that immediately arose was, how did this money get there? The location on the banks of the Columbia River was outside the FBI's calculated drop zone, and the bills were buried in a way that suggested natural, unintentional deposit. The discovery of the money raised more questions than it answered. If Cooper had jumped where the FBI calculated, how did the money reach the banks of the Columbia River? River dynamics experts analyzed the currents and sedimentation patterns. Some concluded that the money could have arrived there through natural deposition carried by water over years. Others argued that the decomposition patterns were not consistent with years of immersion in flowing water. The most disturbing fact, 194,120 was never found. In over 50 years, no other ransom note has appeared in circulation. None was used in any traceable transaction. If Cooper survived and spent the money, he did so in a way that remains completely invisible to the American financial system. If Cooper died, the money rotted with him somewhere in that forest. In 2007, a geological analysis commissioned by independent researchers suggested that the money had been deposited in the Tina Bar between 1974 and 1981, not necessarily in 1971. This time frame raised the hypothesis that someone, perhaps Cooper himself or someone else who had access to the money, had deliberately placed the bills there. But this theory was never confirmed. The suspect's faces for a ghost. More than 1,000 suspects were investigated over 45 years. None were indicted. But some names stood out more than others, whether due to coincidental physical characteristics, military background, or behaviors that caught the attention of independent investigators and researchers. The persistent problem. No physical evidence ever connected any specific person to the crime. Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. carried out a virtually identical hijacking to Cooper's just 5 months later, in April 1972, also on a United Airlines flight. McCoy jumped with $500,000 and was captured 2 days later. The FBI investigated McCoy as a possible Cooper, but the Flight 305 crew did not recognize him, and McCoy had a partial alibi for the day of the original hijacking. He escaped from prison in 1974 and was killed in a confrontation with FBI agents. In 2007, Lyle Christensen revealed that he believed his brother Kenneth, a former paratrooper and Northwest Airlines employee, was D.B. Cooper. Kenneth had worked as a flight attendant on the same route, was intimately familiar with Boeing 727 aircraft, and had parachute experience. He died of cancer in 1994 without leaving a confession. The FBI investigated and ruled out Christensen as a suspect without revealing the full reasons for the exclusion. In 2011, a woman named Marla Cooper stated to the FBI that her uncle, L.D. Cooper, was the hijacker. She described childhood memories of her uncle returning injured on Thanksgiving Day 1971 with blood-stained clothes, murmuring about having committed a crime. The FBI tested DNA from Cooper's tie against samples from L.D. Cooper, and the results were inconclusive due to the low quality of the samples. Robert Rackstraw was perhaps the most media-investigated suspect. A former U.S. Special Forces soldier convicted of numerous crimes of fraud, forgery, and theft, Rackstraw matched the physical profile and had parachute training. An independent research team claimed in 2016 to have found hidden messages in the Zodiac cards that identified Rackstraw as Cooper. The FBI reviewed and rejected the claims. The tie left by Cooper on the plane became the most analyzed object in the case. DNA was extracted, and a partial profile was constructed. The problem. The profile was too common a haplogroup to identify specific individuals, and questions about possible contamination during decades of handling made the results legally unusable. The tie remains under analysis, waiting for DNA technology to advance enough to extract a usable profile. In 2018, a man named Carl Lauren claimed that his late friend William Gossett had confessed to being D.B. Cooper shortly before his death. Gossett had extensive military training, parachute skills, and matched the physical description. The FBI stated that it had previously investigated Gossett and ruled out his candidacy. The posthumous confession, like so many others in the case, was unverifiable. The pattern repeated itself with frustrating regularity. A suspect emerges, generates intense media coverage, is investigated, and ruled out. Without physical evidence connecting anyone to the crime, and with the only available genetic evidence being inconclusive, the case remains where it always was, open. D.B. Cooper could have been any one of these men, or it could have been someone who never even became a suspect. Theories and legacy, the myth that time has not erased. The simplest theory, and possibly the most likely, is that Cooper died on the jump or in the following days. The region where he jumped is extremely hostile. The weather conditions were severe. Without GPS, without adequate survival equipment, possibly injured on landing, Cooper would have faced an almost impossible task. Getting out of the forest alive, in the dark, in winter, carrying a wad of cash. A disturbing detail that emerged years later. One of the 2 civilian parachutes provided to the authorities was a training parachute stitched together and unusable in an actual jump. If Cooper used that parachute, he did not survive. Authorities were never able to determine which of the 2 parachutes Cooper chose to take. But the possibility that he jumped with a defective parachute has fueled decades of speculation. The opposing theory, the one that fuels the myth, is that Cooper survived, buried or disposed of most of the money to avoid tracking, and simply returned to an ordinary life. Perhaps using a false identity. Perhaps returning to a job and a family that never knew anything. This hypothesis is consistent with the total silence of the banknotes. A man who survived but never spent the money because he knew it would betray him. D.B. Cooper's cultural impact was immediate and lasting. By 1976, he had already become a character in a Hollywood film. In 1981, it gained another production. Songs, books, documentaries, series episodes, and podcasts were produced in the following decades. Cooper became a kind of American anti-hero, the ordinary man who defied the system, stole from a large corporation, and disappeared without a trace. In Ariel, a small town in Washington state near the hijacking zone, the case became a tradition. For decades, a local bar hosted D.B. Cooper Days, an annual festival that attracted enthusiasts, researchers, and curious onlookers from all over the country. The festival celebrated not a criminal, but a mystery, the embodiment of the American idea that someone can simply disappear and start over. D.B. Cooper's practical legacy was a revolution in American aviation security. Before the hijacking, it was possible to buy plane tickets with cash without identification and board without any inspection. After the case, the United States gradually implemented the airport security system that evolved into what exists today. A Cooper vane, a device that prevents the rear stairs from opening in flight, was installed on all Boeing 727s in operation. Decades later, the case attracts a vibrant community of amateur investigators, Facebook groups with tens of thousands of members, podcasts dedicated exclusively to the case, researchers who have spent years or decades analyzing flight data, the currents of the Columbia River, the military records of veterans who could match the profile. The search for D.B. Cooper has become for many a way of life, and meanwhile the forest remains. Dense, silent, indifferent. Somewhere between the Lewis and Columbia rivers, or perhaps in a completely different region, may lie the bones of D.B. Cooper, or simply more forest with no answers. Time has passed. The trees have grown. And the secret, if there is one, is more buried than ever. The question that remains. The case of D.B. Cooper remains, officially, the only unsolved airplane hijacking in the history of the United States. In 45 years of investigation, the FBI spent immense resources, investigated over 1,000 suspects, and never arrived at a definitive answer. The formal closure of the active investigation in 2016 was not a conclusion, it was an admission. All we know for sure, a man called himself Dan Cooper. He hijacked a flight with a bomb threat. He received $200,000. He parachuted from a Boeing 727 in mid-flight, and he disappeared. Only $5,880 was found 8 years later, on the banks of a river. The rest never reappeared. D.B. Cooper may have been dead for 50 years, his bones integrated into the forest floor that swallowed him. Or he may have lived a long and ordinary life, watching the news about himself from his sofa, with the silent satisfaction of someone who had won. What is certain is that, whatever the answer, it is buried too deep to be found now. A passage, a false name, a leap into the dark, and 50 years of silence. D.B. Cooper left no trace, but he left a question that no generation has been able to stop asking. Who were you? This is the Dark Files Now channel. Thank you so much for staying with us until now. See you in the next video.